All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Conversations for the Future's February event. It's Valentine's Day. Love is in the air. Perfect time to talk about our love for space and national security. My name is Rachael Zisk, and I'm a reporter for Payload, covering the business and policy of space. We put out a daily newsletter covering space business and policy, and as well as a weekly newsletter that I write covering space science. I'll drop some links to those in the chat below in just a moment. But today we're here to hear from a host of some great speakers. Very excited to just jump right into it. But before we do, a few housekeeping items. If you want to ask a question today to any of our guests, feel free to just drop it in the chat wherever you're watching, or if you're in the Zoom, feel free to unmute and ask your questions. We want to host a full conversation here, so we're excited to hear from everybody. And with that, we will jump right in. We have a very exciting first segment today, Coffee on the Moon with the Galaxis gal, Inara Tabir. Inara is a science communicator and aerospace connector. She's the president of the Multiplanetary Society and the executive director of Gaze in Space. Her work focuses on bridging the public and the industry to secure our future in space. Coffee on the Moon is our new monthly segment, and if you missed part 1 last month, you can find the recording of the live stream on any of F4F's social media channels. In this monthly segment, Inara will be holding interviews to discuss our monthly topic and how through this topic of reference we can work together to be a multiplanetary society. Inara, take it away and introduce us to today's guests you're interviewing.
Thank you so much, Rachael. So first off, we have Richard Banduric. It is my pleasure to introduce Richard. He has been developing hardware and software for spacecraft for the last 20 years. He has worked on NASA and classified defense programs at Lockheed, JPL, United Launch Alliance, and Boeing. He has designed spacecraft subsystems for interplanetary missions, including Europa, Juno, and MRO, as well as classified NRO and Defense Department missions, including the Topaz, the Advanced Orion, and the Quasar series satellites. He is currently the primary researcher for the National Science Foundation, developing a next-generation propulsion system that doesn't need a propellant. Richard, what have you not done?
Oh, I've done a lot in the space industry. So, yeah, and I guess to lead off that, yes, I've worked on a lot of classified programs before I started working my own company. And I originally started this company called Field Propulsion Technologies, originally to present my research to a classified conference called JANF, the Joint Army Navy NASA conference. So after I did that, after I formed the company, I did that presentation as data. I was contacted by DARPA. It says DARPA kind of indicated that they would give me a phase 1 fund, a grant to actually test some of these ideas that I had. So, and I actually started working on that at DARPA in 2019. And with the objective there is we wanted to validate the conditions where Maxwell's equations fail. Because what's happened since the 1900s is there's a lot of conditions that Maxwell's equations fail. And when they originally formulated the equations, nobody knew how to actually validate what these failures were, because we really didn't have the technology or the materials to do it. So under this grant with DARPA, I basically proposed to take 2 current elements that were manufactured differently, and we applied a current through them, and you should get an external force you could use as a propellantless propulsion device.
Now, for those at home who may not know, can you give us the basics of what Maxwell's equations entail?
So Maxwell's equations basically do 2 things. They're an electric field equation and a magnetic field equation. And what James Maxwell did is he had a mathematical construct that linked them together. So he was able to prove using mathematics that the magnetic field and electric field were really the same field. They were just, one is an electric field that's directly from a charge, and the magnetic field is a field that's created from charges moving in a conductor. And that was really great because what that did is now, before that, everybody thought the magnetic field was separate from the electric field. So after his equations were created, we knew we could generate a magnetic field from an electric charge. And we could actually move an electric charge using a magnetic field. So that kind of unified science.
So does this mean we're talking about propellant propulsion, propellantless propulsion?
No, right at this particular point, Maxwell's equations really doesn't have anything to do with propulsion. Maxwell's equations are describing the magnetic force and the electric force. And what I did is some of the conditions that these equations fail in, if they fail, you would generate a propellerless propulsion device.
So that could be a new edge for us in space, certainly.
Yeah, and one of the things that Maxwell's equations also did is it produced a third equation, and nobody could really, get their arms around what this third equation was. So what they did is they have a mathematical construct called a gauge, and they would just basically say this equation is 0 for these conditions, even though nobody's ever proven what these conditions are. But in the 1960s, Adolf Braun, he was able to create a condition where you could actually measure the effects of this equation. So Maxwell's equations, as they're written today, are kind of incomplete.
And that's where you come in.
Yeah, and that's where DARPA wanted me to look at these conditions where they fail, because one of the actual things that comes out of this is that third equation could couple to gravity. And right now, physics can't really unify gravity with the electric force or the magnetic force. These are missing something. And one of the results we got out of this phase 1 grant was what physics is probably missing is since they're really zeroing out this equation, they're really making it impossible for the physics at this time to unify gravity because they need that third equation to unify it.
So that means we need a new class of forces, basically.
Well, we just need, well, so that was one of the things I basically resolved is Maxwell's equations are perfect for a conductor flowing electric current. And that's what we usually use nowadays. We have copper conductors flowing electric current and actually driving things like the technologies I'm talking to now. So those equations work just fine for that. And they never get violated in those conditions. But if you start doing other things with these equations, like the company I'm working with now, so what we created was we created metamaterials that would allow the effects of that third equation to be observed. And then once you do that, now you have at least the possibility of creating a propellantless propulsion device that doesn't violate Maxwell's equations or Newton's equations.
So given that you have all the support, it looks like you've had quite a bit of support along the way for your work. Are you at the application phase now? I mean, how soon would it be to where we could apply what you're doing to the space race?
So right now we have a National Science Foundation grant, and that's a phase 1 grant right now. We anticipate by the phase 2, we will actually have something that somebody can validate. And what that something would basically be a block of material that you apply power to it, and it basically would get lighter or heavier. So the types of materials we've made in the lab so far is a material that you apply a electric current through it, and it gets lighter on the scale. And if you flip it over, it'll get heavier. So the type of forces that it's generating are not anti-gravity, but they are a force that's controllable. And a force that is not a magnetic force and is not an electric force. Because one of the things you can do is try to measure the force with a magnetic field meter or an electric field meter, and you're unable to really measure the field that's causing this force.
So you're at the point where you can create vertical force then?
Yes, we are, and we've been able to do that in the lab. So our next step here, we're working with a couple of companies here, is to actually be able to make these these materials and the power supplies that go with them, so we can take it to just a regular test house and have it tested. Now, under my DARPA contract, we were actually going to try to test these materials at the Glenn Research Center in Ohio. But the problem I had was by the time we got around to do the testing, COVID was here and they had basically shut down. And their response back to me was, within a year or two, they could probably test my my elements. But the problem I had was under DARPA, you have to spend the money by a certain amount of time. So that kind of killed me there. I wasn't able to spend the $50K they gave me to do the testing. So that's one of the reasons why I moved to the National Science Foundation, so that we could have a different path to test these.
So they've been really supportive, it sounds like. That's really good. So what do you need at this point? What further support would you need to get to the hardware point?
Oh, yeah. So under our phase two, we would get about $1 million. Right now, we've gotten 250K to just prototype these elements. I think if we could get another 500K, we could actually have a device that someone could test. And that's what we're anticipating when we get our phase two under the National Science Foundation. The problems we also have on testing here is, so I work with the Defense Department on some of these projects. And one of the requirements they impose on us, it has to be tested in the United States. It can't leave the United States. The technical documentation that we generate here has to be reviewed and all the rest of that. So that's one reason why we really don't put out very much material, because especially under DARPA, they have a whole procedure you have to follow to actually release anything. So, and that's really involved and takes many months to go through. But one of the requirements I have with my National Science Foundation grant is we're going to produce 2 papers. One paper is going to be documenting how these current elements work. And another paper is actually going to do the mathematics that can link the electric force to gravity using Maxwell's third equation.
Now, I understand you're also working on a way to strengthen armor as well, right?
Yeah, so, okay, so let me go back here a bit. So Maxwell's third equation, once you're able to generate it and you can observe effects from it, what it does when it goes through a composite conductor that we've been making, which is called a metamaterial, it'll generate a force inside this material that's either compressive or a tension. And then when it generates this force in the material, it also generates an external force on the material. So these materials that we're building have a number of applications. The first application is basically just to put an electric current through these materials and then observe an external force that you can use for propulsion. But another thing you can use is, so you can put a current through this material and now you can strengthen the material. So now say you had this material around an armor and it's really lightweight because this material is going to be made out of a ceramic. So you basically run the current through it and it puts a tension in there that's going to counteract any impactor coming in on this device. So in our application, we would envision that you could probably strengthen the material by 5 or 10 times by putting this electric current through it. And the material is strengthening because of the energy in the electric current. But the other effect we get here is now we have an external force on the outside, on the faces of this material too. So in a space application, say we had this material around a spacecraft and you saw an impactor was coming towards you. So you would apply an electric current to a panel of this material. So the first thing this material will do is it'll strengthen up. But then as the impactor gets close to this material, all of a sudden it's going to start to feel the same force and be deflected away. So now you have 2 ways to minimize damage here. You can actually deflect the object before it hits the panel, or you can strengthen the panel so when the object does hit it, it doesn't shatter. But that also gives us a couple other applications here is on the hypersonic vehicle that Lockheed's developing and some others. One of the problems they got is when they're going through the atmosphere is you actually start ionizing the air because you're actually going through the atmosphere so hard. So if you were able to take this force and put it around the hypersonic vehicle, you could push the air away from the vehicle in such a way that, so one thing, the vehicle wouldn't be actually touching the air anymore. And the other application is you would minimize this ionization because instead of applying a force onto the atmosphere directly, you're applying a force indirectly. So now you're going to have a vehicle that will be able to fly through the air without any resistance. And it'll also be able to fly through the atmosphere without generating a sonic boom.
That's fantastic. So we're talking about a new class of propulsion system, armor, and the ability to have more stealth built in.
Yeah, basically. And, that was only some of the applications. Because the other people we talked to is at the Navy, because now that we have submarines, that's a big obstacle to them is how fast they can go through the water. If they could take the water and actually just push it away from the outside of a hull of a submarine by just a few millimeters, now all of a sudden, all the resistance that they have going through the water is going to virtually vanish. And right now they have torpedoes that what they do now is they actually pump air around the torpedoes to get them to go, at speeds of 200 or 300 miles an hour. And Russia's big on that. I'm not too sure if the US has, but now we would be able to do the same thing without using compressed air or having to actually surround the vehicle with some type of gas. we would just be putting this force around the vehicle, whatever it is, whether it be a submarine or, a projectile in the water.
So given the immediacy of the need that we have to, take the high ground in space, are there like extreme barriers at the moment to implement your science across the board?
Well, so one of the propellantless propulsion is basically looked down about pretty much everybody. One of the problems I did have working at DARPA was, I would go to a test house and they would say, okay, we have a time slot for you. And they'd come back and say, okay, what kind of gas do you need for it? And I'd be like, well, we don't need any gas. This is going to be just running on electricity. All we need to do is have you give us power. And a number of companies at that point said they didn't want to test it. So that was a big problem for me. That's going to be a big problem today. So the type of forces that we're looking at these materials can produce are not micronewtons. We're looking at producing millinewtons to newtons of force. So our testing requirements are not really that stringent. The only thing we really require is to be in a vacuum and to have power. So that's going to be an obstacle we're going to have to actually address here in the next 6 months or so. That's why we would like to get a partner.
So besides the government partnerships, all of this is happening under the umbrella of Field Propulsion Technologies Incorporated, right?
Yep.
So given how you see your path laid out in front of you, where do you see Field Propulsion Technologies Incorporated in the next 10 years? I mean, are you the industry leader?
Oh yeah, we basically are, but so far nobody else has been able to create a propellantless propulsion device that they've been able to validate. So a number of people are trying at this point. Sonny from NASA, he's working with a group that's trying to build a device like ours. And he has a phase 2 grant from NASA for his work. And we've basically been trying to direct our work more towards the defense area, because really, if the United States can have this type of technology in our defenses, that would be the technology that would allow us to defeat people like China. Because, once you can be able to take an object into space without propellant, you could have an object fly around the atmosphere without having to worry about atmospheric resistance or ionization or generating a sonic boom. That gives you the weapon that could defeat our enemies. So that's the reason we haven't really, put out a lot of announcements to say we've done this, is we really are concentrating on our defense partners to be able to come in and give us the funds to take it to the next step.
Well, unfortunately, we're at such a cultural battle with China at the moment at every angle. It's winner takes all, really, when we talk about the high ground in space. So you're building this out on your side. Do we have anyone close as far as China or Russia or other bad actors when it comes to this technology?
Well, yeah. So no, I do not think China is aware of what we're working on. So that's one of the reasons why we try to keep a low profile, is so people like China is always looking for some new technology that they want to steal, and they're going to copy it. So we try to keep everything we're doing out of the, basically, off the internet, so people can just, search for it and actually look at it. But I'm not too sure about Russia. So I have worked with some people in Russia, and I get the impression that they've been actively working on this, and they might have something up their sleeves. They've had 2 satellites that went up there, Kronos 2491 and 2499, that went up there. Russia basically snuck those satellites up in orbit behind another payload. And we were able to figure out that they did that because all of a sudden these satellites started moving around on their own, and they were too small to have any propellant on board. So people got real interested in them, that they might have a working propellantless propulsion system. But the first one, 91, that blew up within a year. But the latest one, 99, has been in space now for over 10 years. It just recently blew up here in January. But that satellite has been able to maneuver from an orbit of less than 100 miles up to an orbit of 800 miles. And that satellite has basically just been trucking around to all these different points in space, because one of the things that countries like to do, or they really want to do, is they want to take their satellites and move them around their enemies' satellites. Like Russia wanted to take their little satellites and move them up by next to our satellites. And the things they want to do there then is take pictures and photograph them. And the other trick that people do is, attach an explosive device to them. So when it comes time to take them out, all they got to do is push a button. And, it's kind of suspicious that 99 just blew up in this last month. There's kind of indications that somebody probably decided they had enough of it and they wanted to get rid of it, because when it did explode, they did end up putting a lot of debris in space, and that debris is not going to come out of orbit for another 100 years. So that's
well, it's unfortunate we're seeing this new theater of war, and not really that new, but it's becoming more of an issue, this theater of war in the satellite field. So we're seeing more dual usage satellites and weaponized satellites, and that's going to be a huge focus for Space Force, of course.
Yeah. And, the United States has been doing a lot. We have a number of vehicles up there that are, trying to track the satellites, and then all these different techniques that I've been expressing, we've been doing for a long time. But then, we're starting to get to the point where I'm not allowed to discuss stuff like that.
Yeah, makes sense. So I want to give some time. We have a few more minutes. Let's give everyone here some time to ask questions. I know there's probably a lot out there. If you're here with us in Zoom, feel free to unmute and ask directly. And if you have the option of putting it in the chat, we'll go ahead and read from the chat as well.
Okay, well, I mean, that's fine if they don't have questions and stuff.
It's a lot to think about. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, for me,
Richard, it's Nino. I'll ask a question.
Yeah, please.
It's Nino Marcantonio from the DTEP. So how fast do you think we can get to Mars in the next 5 to 10 years? Like, given if we develop the technology in where you get the right backing and the right partners within the government that we're working on.
Oh, well, so that's the problem right now, so it takes so long to get to Mars. The NASA is looking at funding nuclear rockets, and I don't know how nuclear rocket could take you to Mars within maybe 2 weeks, but now you're dealing with a very big system that you're going to basically have to bring a big payload there, because you're using nuclear fusion to be able to propel the rocket, or some other nuclear technology. But from our technology, we're using electricity. We should be able to match the performance characteristics of nuclear fusion that they're promoting. And our vehicle, instead of weighing millions of pounds, it's probably going to weigh just a few thousand pounds. And the advantage is we won't have to carry any propellant. And we should be able to get to Mars in the same type of time frame. Because really, we're going to be able to do a continuous thrust for a whole week. So which basically means the rockets are on for a whole week, and then so now you're at a really high speed, and then after that week you just do the reverse, and then now you're there at Mars, and it doesn't really matter how far away Mars is, because you just basically have to just put more thrust out for that week, right?
Disruptive technology it is. Well, thank you for working with the DTEP. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, DTEP's been really helpful for us.
Well, it sounds like Mars is no big deal, Nino. I want to know if this opens up the interstellar world to us. It sounds like this is really a stepping stone towards interstellar travel.
Yeah, it is. I think this technology could be upgraded to the point where things like Star Trek are probably the warp drive. People are actually working on the warp drive, and because from the science point of view, that is possible. The big key we have right now is how do we modify the space-time metric. And I think that's where we have the advantage, is we think the Maxwell's third equation is the key that will allow you to modify the space-time metric. So
yeah, that's why I was so interested in working with your group, specifically on those art of the possibles, and is what we scout for. Thank you for answering that. Thank you.
Well, I know for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be digging in as much as I can into what you're doing. It sounds like this is the future. So thank you so much, Richard.
Yeah, I think it is too. And hopefully we'll be able to just change the whole world with this. Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. A pleasure.